Alright, now that we've talked about the simple and the compound sentences, we're now ready to talk about the complex sentences. So that's what this section is about. Let's get started. So first of all, what is a complex sentence? Basically, a complex sentence is when you have a dependent clause plus an independent clause. So you'll recall from the previous video that an independent clause is a complete idea. On the other hand, a dependent clause is an incomplete idea. So when we have a dependent clause and an independent clause put together, we call that a complex sentence. Now, what do we use to connect the dependent and the independent clause to each other? We use what is called a subordinating conjunction. So we'll talk about subordinating conjunctions very soon. First, let's take a look at some examples of complex sentences. So here's our first sentence. Whereas Britain invested over £1 million in books, France only invested 100,000. In this case, the word whereas is the subordinating conjunction. I want you to notice that France only invested 100,000 is an independent clause. It's a complete idea and it can stand by itself. That means that if we were to just write this clause as its own sentence, it would still make sense, because it's a complete idea. On the other hand, if we were to say, whereas Britain invested over £1 million in books, this is not a complete idea, because we're using the word whereas to make a comparison. So when we say this sentence, we have to compare it with something else. Therefore, we cannot just stop the sentence here. We have to add some extra information to complete the sentence. In this case, we need to complete the comparison. Let's look at another example. Switzerland ranked the highest in 1999, although it was outranked by Britain the following year. Now in this case, the word although is acting as the subordinating conjunction. And this subordinating conjunction is connecting the dependent clause with the independent clause. So here in the blue color, we have the independent clause. Switzerland ranked the highest in 1999. You'll notice that this is a complete idea. If you were to stop the sentence here, it would still make sense. On the other hand, the dependent clause is incomplete. So here, this dependent clause only makes sense when we join it together with the independent clause. Do you get it? So an independent clause is called independent because it doesn't need anything else. It can stand alone by itself. It's complete. However, a dependent clause is incomplete. It needs to depend on something else. As a rule, we place these subordinating conjunctions at the beginning of the dependent clauses. So you'll notice that here we put the subordinating conjunction at the beginning of the dependent clause, and we've done the same over here. So it doesn't matter if the dependent clause comes first or if the dependent clause comes second. The important thing here is that the subordinating conjunction has to be placed at the beginning of the dependent clause. And when we use these dependent clauses in a sentence, we form what are called complex sentences. Now let's look at some examples of how we use subordinating conjunctions to form complex sentences. We'll start with the word although. Here's our example. Although this proposal has some drawbacks, its advantages far outweigh the disadvantages. Notice that this first half is the dependent clause, and this second half is the independent clause. Next, we have the subordinating conjunction despite. Here's our example. Despite the new regulations, many people still do not fully disclose their income to the government. The first half is the dependent clause, and the second half is the independent clause. Next, we have unless. Walking is better than driving unless one is in a hurry. Here we have the independent clause before the dependent clause. Here's the next example. It is important to consider one's financial situation before traveling abroad, unless one is wealthy. Notice that in this sentence, we have an independent clause plus a dependent clause plus another dependent clause. So in this sentence, we have one independent clause and two dependent clauses. Here's our last example. Certainly this could happen, although the odds are remote. Here we have the independent clause, and here we have the dependent clause. I want you to notice that in all of these examples, we place the subordinating conjunctions at the beginning of the dependent clauses. Now, you may have noticed that sometimes with the subordinating conjunction, we use a comma, and other times we don't. So you may be wondering, when exactly should we use a comma with a subordinating conjunction, and when should we not? So let's talk about that. There are a few basic rules. The first of these rules is that if the dependent clause comes before the independent clause, then you should place the comma at the end of the dependent clause. So in this case, here we have the dependent clause, and here we have the independent clause. The dependent clause comes before the independent clause. So in this case, we have to place a comma at the end of the dependent clause. The second rule is that if the dependent clause comes after the independent clause, then the comma is usually not used. So here we have examples of this. Here we don't use a comma in both of these sentences. Why? Because here we have an independent clause that comes before the dependent clause. So when we have a situation like this, in most cases, we do not use a comma. However, I want you to notice that there are exceptions to this rule, as can be seen in this sentence over here. The next rule is that if the subordinating conjunction is used to give extra information, for example, if we're just adding extra information as an afterthought, then we must use a comma. So in this example, we've used this dependent clause to simply add extra information, okay? This wasn't really required. We don't have to add this information. We could just put a full stop here and end this sentence right here. However, we chose to add extra information as an afterthought, and therefore we have to use a comma. Lastly, I want you to note that the word although is an exception. A comma is almost always used whenever although appears in the middle of a sentence, as you can see in the example over here. Now let's take a look at a list of subordinating conjunctions. Here we have our list, and I want you to note that this is not a complete list. However, these are some of the most common subordinating conjunctions that are used in the English language. Words like though, although, as though, since, because, despite are very common, and you're probably going to use them in your IELTS writing and speaking. So you may be wondering now, when exactly should I use the complex sentences in my writing? Well, we usually use the complex sentences when we're comparing and contrasting two different pieces of data or information. So let's look at an example of that. Let's say that you see this bar graph on your IELTS writing task 1, and you're trying to describe the data from the year 1995. If you're writing about the year 1995, you could say something like, in general, it is evident that in 1995, local fixed line calls were the most prominent choice, whereas mobiles were the least popular. Do you see how we've used the subordinating conjunction whereas to compare two different pieces of information? We're saying that on the one hand, the local fixed line calls were very prominent, meaning that they were very popular. On the other hand, mobiles were the least popular. So we have compared two contrasting pieces of information in a single sentence. That's the power of a complex sentence. Let's look at another example now. Let's say that you get this map question, and you have to describe the differences that you see between the two maps. In this case, you could say something like, although the island used to be vacant and undeveloped in the past, it is now fully developed and equipped with tourist facilities. Do you see how we're using the word although to compare two contrasting pieces of information? We're saying that on the one hand, the island used to be vacant and undeveloped in the past. On the other hand, now it is fully developed and equipped with tourist facilities. So by using complex sentences, we have mentioned two contrasting pieces of information in a single sentence. So these are the type of sentences that the IELTS examiners are looking for. They want to see if you're able to form such complex structures. So make sure that you use some complex sentences in your writing to show off your grammatical range. So that's all for this video. I hope that you now have a clear understanding of what are simple sentences, compound sentences, and complex sentences, and that you now understand how to use them in your writing. I'll see you in the next grammar section, in which we'll talk about correlative conjunctions.